Chambers made the drive, and Rucker left later that night and called a Lyft to take him home. A vehicle was already in position to follow it. Surveillance footage would later show that vehicle trailing the Lyft the entire way to Rucker's house on Royal Court. As Rucker arrived home, Chambers caught up with him and shot him to death. What looked like a single murder was already part of something larger. The evidence from that night would soon connect the motel, the journey home, and the people investigators believed were involved. Investigators would eventually pull the days and zone registration records find the same detail. The audience already knows that the room was tied to Chambers' phone number. Cell phone tower data show Chambers and Brown are moving west together within hours of the shooting. But Rucker's death wasn't where this chain of violence began. 4 days earlier, another killing in Athens had already set a retaliation effort in motion. To understand why Rucker died outside his own house, you have to go back 4 days to December, when a Gangster Disciples member named Walter James Brown was shot and killed at the Oak Hill Apartments, also in Athens. That killing drew real local attention on its own. 3 other men were eventually arrested and indicted for Brown's murder, under a separate theory that stemmed from a drug dispute. But all 3 later struck plea deals that saw murder charges against them dropped. Whether those 3 men were the same 3 people Chambers and Brown are believed were responsible isn't something the record makes clear. What is clear is that inside the Gangster Disciples, Brown's death sets off its own search for who was responsible. The critical distinction is that investigators were dealing with 2 different things: Brown's original murder and the retaliation that followed. The federal case would ultimately focus heavily on that second chain of events. The Gangster Disciples, commonly shortened to GD, claim a presence in at least 25 states today, governed by what federal prosecutors call positions of authority. Philmon Chambers, known on the street as Dollar Phil, held one of the more dangerous ones. He oversaw the gang's enforcement team, sometimes called the elimination team, internally. The unit tasked with disciplining members and answering violence, with more of it on the order of leadership. Chambers and Brown settled on 3 they believe were responsible for Brown's death, and Rodriquez Rucker happened to be related to one of them. What sets this case apart from almost every other Gangster Disciples prosecution on record is the role Brown played in it. Inside the gang, male members are formally referred to as the Brothers of the Struggle. Female members have their own parallel designation, the Sisters of the Struggle, a structure with its own internal leadership, separate from being anyone's girlfriend or associate. Andrea Brown held a leadership position inside it. In case after case involving the Gangster Disciples, it's the Brothers of the Struggle who end up named in the indictments and pictured in the press releases. Brown's case is one of the clearest on record, where a leader of the sisters didn't just support a killing, she arranged it, then sent the text that put it in motion. That structure matters because prosecutors described both Chambers and Browner as more than peripheral figures. Their alleged roles helped investigators explain how a personal act of revenge could become an organized operation. The search for them moved fast. On December 15th, just 1 day after Rucker was killed, police caught up with Browner deep in East Texas near Mount Enterprise and took her into custody. Chambers had been in the same vehicle and fled before officers could close in, leaving Browner to face arrest alone. He surfaced in a Gangster Disciples safe house in Texas, a city built up around the edges of Fort Hood. Cut off from what was happening back home, and unable to verify anything for himself, Chambers convinced himself that 2 specific people in Athens, a man named Derek Ruff and another named Joshua Jackson, had started talking to police about Rucker's murder. Court records show he had little real evidence behind that suspicion. It didn't matter. Chambers decided they needed to die. And he gave the order from 600 miles away. He couldn't carry it out himself. So the job went to Leslie Chappell Green, known inside the gang as Grip, who held the title of Assistant Chief Enforcer, under the same structure Chambers had once run in person. Green, along with 2 more gang members, Robert Carl Law, known as Different, and Shabazz Giddy, known as Little Larry, carried out the plan. None of the 3 told Ruff and Jackson they had been marked. Instead, they told them Chambers needed help. as a show of loyalty to a leader hiding from the law. The men were told they should drive out to Lawrenceville, Georgia, break into a row of storage units, and ship back whatever they found, as a kind of tribute to send him while he stayed underground. Ruff and Jackson agreed as far as either man knew. They were doing a favor for a friend in trouble. Neither of them understood that the errand they were driving toward was their own execution. On December 19th, 9 days after Walter Brown's murder and 5 days after Rucker's, Green, Carlisle, and Guidry shot and killed Ruff and Jackson and sealed their bodies inside one of the very storage units. The two men had been sent there to break into. By now, the case had expanded far beyond Rucker's murder. 2 more men were dead, multiple locations were involved, and investigators were beginning to see what looked less like isolated violence and more like a connected retaliation chain. Georgia prosecutors in Athens, Clark County had already made one attempt at justice for Rucker's murder. By then, in 2019, they indicted Chambers and Brown locally on state charges: malice, murder, felony murder, and violations of Georgia's gang terrorism law. That case stalled. Neither of them was ever tried in a Georgia courtroom. What kept the investigation alive wasn't the local system. It was the FBI's Middle Georgia Safe Streets Gang Task Force, working with detectives from Athens, Clark, and Gwinnett counties, quietly building something far larger than a single murder case. Over the next 3 years, a federal racketeering indictment that would tie all 4 deaths. That shift was crucial. A federal racketeering investigation allowed prosecutors to present the killings not simply as separate crimes, but as alleged acts connected to a broader criminal enterprise. On June 16, 2022, a federal grand jury in Macon returned an indictment naming all 5: Chambers, Browner, Green, Carlisle, and Guidry. All 5 face racketeering conspiracy charges. Chambers and Browner alone carried the heaviest counts: murder and 8 of racketeering tied directly to the killing. On royal court, the case moved forward under Project Safe Neighborhoods, a joint federal, state, and local program built around the idea that the most violent offenders in a community get targeted first. The prevention and re-entry partners work in the other end of the same problem. By the summer of 2023, it was clear not everyone intended to fight the case to the end. On June 8th, Carla and Guidry, 2 of the 3 men who had pulled the triggers in Lawrenceville, pleaded guilty ahead of trial. Chambers, Browner, and Green did not take a deal. Jury selection began on July 31, 2023, in front of Chief U.S. District Judge Mark Treadwell in Macon. Over the following weeks, prosecutors laid out the full chain for the jury, using cell phone records and surveillance footage. The footage gathered across 3 years of investigation, the days in registration that tied Chambers to the motel, to the storage unit outside Lawrenceville, where the last 2 victims were found. At trial, the strength of the case depended on connecting events separated by time and distance. Digital records, surveillance evidence, and communications helped prosecutors build that timeline for the jury. On August 17th, the jury came back guilty on every count for all 3 defendants. Acting Assistant Attorney General Nicole Argentieri summed it up when the convictions were announced. "These defendants," she said, "had placed the gangster disciples' rule of revenge above the rule of law." Sentencing came in 2 rounds. On February 20th, 2024, Leslie Green, the man who had carried out the Lawrenceville killings on Chambers' orders from 600 miles away, was sentenced to life in prison. Prosecutors said at the time that no sentence could undo what Green's actions had cost the victims' families. 1 month later, on March 20th, Chambers and Brown stood in front of the same judge on the same day. Chambers, who had personally shot Rucker outside his own home and then ordered 2 more killings while hiding in another state, was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 10 additional years. Browner, who had led the gang's own documented sisterhood and sent the text that started everything, was sentenced to 2 concurrent 30-year terms. Run the numbers forward, and barring any change to her sentence, Andrea Browner could walk free sometime in her 60s. Philip Chambers never will. The convictions brought the federal prosecution to its conclusion, but they could not reverse the violence that started the case. Several killings, multiple families, and years of investigation had all grown from a cycle of retaliation that unfolded in just days.